All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us in the room. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's Friday. We are so lucky today to have Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri with us for our latest edition of America Through the Eyes of Ambassador Ashok Mirpuri. And we started this series some time ago, partly in the run-up to the US election this year, because we got to get revved up about it, and partly because in my current role as CEO of the American Chamber of Commerce, and by the way, my name is Hsien, people like to give me a lot of feedback about the United States. And a lot of it's kind of unsolicited, but I feel like I'm a good target. So I thought, why not just go ahead and give us feedback in a more open forum? And that's the whole intent. It's not that we all love feedback, although we sure need it. And generally speaking, we learn more from not so positive feedback. So this session is not intended, Ambassador, to be all, pink and roses and balloons and unicorns.
Okay, that's why we're pink shirts. So, right, yeah. We're both in pink full, yes.
But we really need to learn about America. That's my country. I'm Chinese American. And we really need to be able to learn about each other and have an open dialogue, whether it's on topics that are a bit difficult and others that are a bit more fun. So that's what it's going to be like this morning. It's a bit of a mix. We have people in the room with us. We have people online with us. And we have people virtually via Zoom. The first half of this session is on LinkedIn Live. So it'll be between me and Ambassador Mirpuri. And then the second half of it, we will move to the Zoom session, which will be a little bit more casual, and it will be open to people who sign up and register, and the link will be provided for you. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for joining us. I could read your bio, but I'll take the whole session. So I'm just going to make some highlights. I understand that you, before returning to Singapore in the last couple of years, you were out of the country for about 30 years. So I want to learn more about that because that's something you and I have in common. I married a Singaporean 30 years ago, have not lived in my own country since 98. And so I wanted to get a feel for how you kind of transitioned back and you're thinking about that. And generally speaking, you've had a really long and illustrious career, how you kind of look at the world through this ambassadorial lens, but also when you are not being the ambassador, how does the world look to you? Maybe I hand it over to you for just an open commentary about your relation to the United States and coming back home, and how does that feel?
Well, thank you. Thank you, Hsien, for putting this together, and thank you for having a live audience in the room because I'll be watching you for reactions to see how this goes. But I actually left Washington exactly a year ago. I finished my term in June 2023 and got back home. And so it's been a year for me to reflect about the US. When I got to the US in 2012, I started my assignment as Singapore ambassador. It was a very new place for me. I had never lived for an extensive period in the US. I'd been there for programs and courses. And in fact, in the mid-1990s, the US Embassy had invited me to join the International Visitor Program because I had no US background. I spent my career in diplomacy, started a career in diplomacy. And in fact, during my time in Washington, D.C., they did invite me back because I was an ambassador who came back, who went on one of these programs. And those programs in the 1990s, and they still continue it on today, give you a very good sense of the US in a very potted fashion. I did Washington, D.C., I did New York, I did Hawaii, I did San Francisco. I went to Nebraska and got a chance to live with a family in Nebraska. And so that, in a month, put it all together. But coming back and living for 11 years was a very different dynamic to it. Obviously, anyone involved in foreign policy, whether as a diplomat, whether as someone in the sort of think tank world, is always thinking about the US because the US is the global superpower. That has been the case. That is still remains the case. They remain the most consequential country in the world. We can get into some of the issues the US is facing now and how the world geopolitics is changing. But when I got there in 2012, we're coming out of that period where the end of the Cold War in the early 1990s, oppressive globalization, the US was a consequential power. And it gave me a chance to see the US first largely through the eyes of Washington, D.C., because I spent most of my time over there. But I consciously stepped out and tried to travel to almost every state. I missed one. And so maybe we'll have an opportunity to go back and do that. But again, traveling across what people call flyover country, going to the south, going to the southwest, going down to southeast, talking to people at all these places gave me a sense of the country. What I came away as I got into Washington, D.C., having spent the time in diplomacy, in Southeast Asia is that intellectual depth and breadth of being in Washington, D.C. There is no other global capital like Washington, D.C. Anything you want to learn, someone is there happy to tell you about it. You want to learn about AI today, you will go and talk to someone who will be able to tell you what it is. And the ability for Washington, I mean, people disparage Washington and they say, it's just filled up with bureaucrats and politicians. The ability to attract the best and the brightest of American society, to come and work in administrations, work in departments like the Department of State, Department of Defense, Department of Treasury, work as congressional staffers, work in think tanks. That ability to pull to this small sort of geography was really quite remarkable for someone coming from outside to be able to engage at that level of conversation. And so I think that was an interesting part. Because I had moved to Washington. My previous assignment before that was ambassador to Indonesia. I had moved from Jakarta, city of 13 million people, to go into Washington. It was basically a provincial town in many ways. But I enjoyed it because it is such a walkable city. And for people who go out, it is really a place where it's human scale. It's not massive like New York. The buildings are not 50, 60, 70 stories high. Everything is within a reasonable limit. So both professionally and personally, I enjoyed my time in the US.
I heard you like to do runs there too.
Yep. So the last run I did was just last year before I left, the Cherry Blossom 10-mile run. And sort of was a good way to sort of finish off doing that. And again, DC is a wonderful place to be able to get out, enjoy the city. Everyone is out during the period, sort of exercising, whatever, riding a bike, walking, running. Yeah.
It's a beautiful city. Well, just riding off of the whole Washington, D.C. thing, you were there through 3 administrations. You were there when President Obama was there, President Trump, and then President Biden. I think people would be very curious. And I saw some photos of you with President Obama. You were just so actively engaged with the administration. What have you observed in terms of the relationship between the U.S. and Singapore through these different administrations? And how was it different for you being the ambassador?
Singapore is in a privileged place with the US. We have a very, very close relationship, a very close economic relationship. We have a free trade agreement that was signed, in fact, 20 years ago. One of the few FTAs the US had done, and I think it's unlikely you'll see new FTAs coming up from the US, but that became a part of an important connection with Singapore and with US companies coming to Singapore. Because of the FTA, because of the economic relationship, I had an opportunity dealing with the administration to talk about where trade is, what the trade agenda is. When I got there, we were still talking about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, working with the Obama administration on the Trans-Pacific Partnership and building a very strong economic relationship, which was a key part. There's a very strong defense relationship. We signed an MOU with the US in 1990. 15-year extensions, most recently extended in 2019 during the Trump administration, goes on till 2035. And if you look at the sort of significant security and defense cooperation with the US, it is at a level that surpasses most other countries. And then a sort of social educational relationship with the US as well. Under the FTA, Singapore gets H-1B1 status, which means Singapore young people, anyone can go have an opportunity to work in the US quite easily. Students coming to study across the board, whether in the Northeast, in Boston, in New York, obviously in California, Stanford, the whole San Francisco. So I had the opportunity of really seeing this thing as a whole. And again, an ambassador coming in does not dramatically change relationships. I had the opportunity to build on many, many years of this relationship that my predecessors had started, and including our leaders who constantly engage with their US counterparts. In the 11 years that I was there, I think Prime Minister Lee, then Prime Minister Lee, must have come 10 or 11 times, which is sort of a remarkable state of engagement at the very, very senior level. And that helps the work that I did because the Prime Minister, the Foreign Minister, the Trade Minister, the Defense Minister were actively engaged with their counterparts. US leaders were coming to Singapore quite regularly as well. Even during the pandemic, Vice President Harris's first visit was to Singapore, and we managed it under the COVID conditions. President Trump, when he wanted to do a summit with Kim Jong-un, decided to pick Singapore. So there's this constant movement back and forth, a sort of deep trust, a deep understanding of each other, which really helps, despite the fact that Singapore is a small country. We never take away from that because in a way, when you get to Washington, D.C., the Singapore diplomat has to work 3 times harder than other diplomats. British ambassador turns up, the red carpet is rolled out for her currently. French ambassador, the German ambassador, even, sort of other countries. Singapore's, because we're not a problematic relationship, you just have to work harder. But again, Washington rewarded the hard workers. They rewarded people who were able to go out, engage on Capitol Hill, engage in the administration. And because administrations turn over through the 3 administrations, people that I knew in the Obama administration came back into senior roles in the Biden administration. And that churn keeps taking place, which made that extended period at I-State much more useful and productive.
Doesn't everyone just want to go to Washington right now? You're selling the city so well.
Because it gets very hot in summer.
Sure,
And Washington air conditioning is not like Singapore air conditioning. So let's just be practical about that.
That's true. Well, it's interesting that you say Singapore has to work harder because 30 years ago, when I married that Singaporean husband of mine, he also had to work pretty hard to explain to those of us, we were in college at the time, where the heck Singapore was to begin with, and explain to us that no, it wasn't all grass huts and tropical and palm trees and everything. So I can understand how hard it might be to explain Singapore. So I'm imagining you going to all 49 states out of the 50. And yes, people, there are 50 states. Okay, people are like, oh, are there 52 states? No, 50. And if you're curious, come to the AmCham office. We have a huge map of the United States back there, which had the ambassador autograph every single state except for Wyoming. So we'll get you there.
AmCham, lead a delegation to Wyoming. I will join you.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's interesting you talk about the different states. As Americans, we know that depending on which state you're from, your voice is either louder or softer. You have more push and pull. I'm from California, so you can imagine what that's like. And, Ambassador, as you're going around, aside from the trade conversation, which can be difficult with Americans, what about other parts of the conversation on foreign relations and all of that? Because, there's this other piece of being American that sometimes rubs people the wrong way. It's not just one piece, I know, but one piece is about this whole idea about democracy, right? In the Atlantic earlier this year, there's an article written about the fact that this idea of the Americans going out there and saying democracy is best isn't really selling very well. And in fact, Americans are like, that is low priority, man. So when you go to all of these 49 states, what are Americans telling you about foreign relations, about Singapore, and what do they want you to take away when you visit their state?
Well, first, there's a curiosity about Singapore. There's a curiosity about other countries. And whenever I went, I did a lot of speeches, spoke to any group that wanted me to speak. And there was always that interest in foreign policy. I got to Washington at the time when the Obama administration had announced the pivot to Asia. And people wanted to know, what is this pivot about? Because for a long time, Washington is a very Atlantic city. They look across the Atlantic to Europe, and that's their traditional that's what foreign policy is. You were dealing with the Soviet Union, you were dealing with Atlantic partners, and suddenly Asia becomes where the administration wants to do a pivot. And this was, China obviously looms large in these conversations, but people were curious and they wanted to know. And I think that curiosity was fascinating for me because it gave me a chance to explain about Singapore, to explain in many ways Singapore's approaches. Very, very young country relative to the United States, a very different sort of basis, sort of economically successful in a generation and a half, that very dramatic changes that people were always quite interested. Now, there is in the American sort of context, this sense that we can make the world a better place. I think that's where the democracy conversation comes out. There is a whole Washington consensus around we can make the world better on economics as well. Follow our model and you can get your things right. Now, that has also been frayed more. Democracy is also being frayed as well. But in a way, having both the Washington consensus around economics and having the conversation on democracy, whether or not you agree with it, helped put the US on a certain position that someone could look up to. It gave the US a moral standing. You did not have to agree with it, but it said, we want to build this not because we want you to be like us, but we want you to be successful like us. And they saw this as really that model of where they want to go. So I had differences with them about how they view politics in different countries. In a way, they had a very simplistic view, as you argue, because it was very black and white. If you remember during the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022, the administration framed it as democracy versus autocracy, which was too black and white for the rest of the 142 countries that voted to criticize the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Not all of them agreed with that taxonomy of how it goes. So I think that differences, that sort of large area in between the sort of democracy versus autocracy, I think that is less understood when you go out in the rest of America, even in sometimes Washington, D.C.
What was the most unexpected thing that anybody said to you when you were going around the States?
I mean, people who were not familiar with I didn't have people thinking we were grass huts and trees. I had every time I went, I always made sure I showed a video of Singapore.
Oh,
and when you show a video, it can be a 90-second video, but you see, and people cannot imagine that this is really sort of a place that exists, because you have, buzzy, active videos. The year that Singapore became really, really popular was 2018. First, because of the Trump-Kim summit.
Yeah.
Suddenly, all the world's cameras are on Singapore. And Crazy Rich Asians, 2018. Everyone wanted to go to Singapore because of Crazy Rich Asians. And they think we're like Crazy Rich Asians, which we're not. But no. I did not do very much to dispel that myth that Singapore is all Crazy Rich Asians.
So I think Americans like a bit of entertainment. So Crazy Rich Asians, I think, play pretty well. Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about, how Singapore is a relatively young country, because certainly it is. Last year, AmCham celebrated our 50th anniversary, and I had DPM Heng Swee Kiat sitting next to me, and he was joking because I myself turned 50 recently, and he said to me, "Oh, just another 50 years, and you and AmCham and Singapore all around the same age group." I was like, "Sir." But having a young country is interesting concept, because I kind of think, this is my own premise, and I wonder what you think of this. So we obviously have a bit of chaos in the United States. And recently there have been a number of protests on university campuses. And many of us are quite distraught over the situation. Depending on if it was your school or not, it didn't matter. You just saw a lot of chaos. And part of my hypothesis is that the United States is a more mature country. And we are known, because of the 50 states, have a lot of different opinions and different ethnic groups and just a lot going on. So to some extent, I'm thinking, are we able to better handle chaos and dissent because we're a more mature society and country, and we're much larger? Does that actually help in terms of the ability to cope with differences of opinions, is when a country is a bit older, and also when it's as big as the United States? Do you think that makes sense through your eyes?
I think that the size of the United States demands that diversity. You go in the East Coast, you go on the West Coast, you go to the center parts. There are differences. And the system is designed as federal state systems. So states can organize themselves differently. Look at some of the cultural war debates around abortion. Look at some of these issues. States want to say, we want to do it on our own. And in a way, that diversity becomes partly the strength of the United States. It's the federal system, and the federal has certain responsibilities, but even things like education go down to the local most level. It surprised me, coming from a Singapore system where education is a national system. You have a national curriculum. Every child is taking common exams at the age of 12 and 16 and 18. That in the US, it is just so diversified right down to the bottom level. It does mean you've got very, very strong peaks, but you also have troughs to deal with. I think that's the challenge. But that was the way the Constitution was put together. That's the way the United States was pulled together. Differences among the states, the federal system, and that is constantly being contested and tested. And you have, because you're a large country, continent-wide, because you can, if you do not like a particular thing happening in a particular state, you can move to another state. You have that ability to pick up a young person who decides, I'm growing up and I don't really like this I want to go somewhere else, and they can pick up and move. So I think that gives you that cushion and that ability to deal with the diversity. And it's a particular strength of the US that you want to engage, bring that states out. People tend to view it only from the lens of Washington, D.C. I mean, the difficulty watching international media, having left the US, and the sources of information really just international media, they tend to look at it only from the lens of the US, of Washington, D.C., maybe New York, maybe San Francisco. The wider lens, being over there, getting out, seeing places, really gives you a sense of where that diversity comes out. And people want to express some of that diversity. You see it in the food, you see it in the dress, you see it in how they want to carry themselves. And because it is a big, more mature country, older country, they have that capability to deal with it. Not many countries actually can deal with this federal state sort of differences. And sometimes it is challenged. Sometimes you look at it and you wonder, where might this potentially lead to? You had a civil war not very, 150 years ago. And, you wonder how far this can go. But you think about these things and you look at the US and say, okay, I need to change some of my mental lenses of looking at Washington, D.C. and the US.
Yeah. Speaking of Civil War, did you see the movie?
I did.
What'd you think?
Yeah, nice fiction.
It was pretty wild, right? But
Okay.
It made me kind of nervous. But you mentioned anything could happen in a country as diverse. And when it comes to diversity, I do think we like to think that because AmCham represents American businesses and American business values, one of which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. I don't know though. Sometimes it feels like we're paying lip service to it, and probably that there has been a backlash in the United States against DEI, thinking that you talk about it a lot, but is there any movement? In your experience in the United States, and given that you are not, as we say in Singapore, Ang Mo, right? Right? We are Asian, and how did you feel being Asian in the United States?
I never felt the problem. I mean, the US has always brought in migrants to the society. Most came first from, of course, from Europe, so Northern Europeans and others. But migration is a fundamental part of US society. I think every American I met would have had a grandparent born overseas, if not a parent. And so that is really part of US society. Yes, there are people with different ethnic senses, but you never felt, in fact, the US melting pot model works well for the US. Not every country necessarily would follow such a model. Singapore is multicultural. We do not follow the melting pot model. We have people who come from around the world as well. But the US had this melting pot model. And I saw this, they're particularly interesting when I visited the party conventions in 2012. When I first got there, President Obama was running for re-election. So both the Republican and Democratic convention, you see such a mix and range of people for both parties coming together who want to commit that this is really how we want to shape the country. And so that ability is not that you have ethnic-based parties. It's a combined melting pot country. So I found it quite fascinating to see that. So I never felt that different. Yes, during COVID, there were a lot of concerns about attacks on particularly people of Chinese or Asian backgrounds. And you go through this. After 9/11, people encountered some of these things as well. But sometimes there are these tribal sort of instincts that come in. But overall, most Americans are very open to foreigners.
Yeah. And part of, I think, the gift of being a country of many, many decades and hundreds of years of history is the ability to learn from history. And so there have been awful Asian hate incidents over the country's existence. And hopefully we remind ourselves of that and never repeat again. In thinking about the history of the United States and the engagement with, other countries, I do wonder, when we have congressional delegations that come to Singapore and we have US government visitors like Secretary Raimondo last week, one of the things that I always make sure to repeat is we love having you here, right? Thank you so much for coming to our region. Thank you for paying attention to the Indo-Pacific. Do you feel that the United States has adequately, during the Obama administration, the phrase I believe was pivot to Asia, and then over the years it's kind of morphed into this Indo-Pacific concept and the whole idea of Indo-Pacific economic framework, and commenting on the focus on on Asia. And you mentioned the tendency for Washington to look across the Atlantic, but we're over here and we constitute quite a large population. In fact, if we add everybody up, we're the largest population in the whole world when you add up all Asia, right? But we're here. Do you think that there's been adequate attention? I mean, I love seeing them here, but I'm not sure it's enough. How should I benchmark that?
I think cabinet secretaries, presidents, vice presidents coming through, that's become now part of the framework already. Whether it's for an ASEAN meeting, whether it's for a APEC meeting, whether it's a G20 meeting, whether the East Asia Summit, they come through. And just last week, you had Secretary Raimondo there, you had Secretary Austin here for Shangri-La Dialogue. You have a couple of congressional delegations coming through. I think the U.S. Focus has, because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, shifted back across the Atlantic, because that has become a major foreign policy crisis. And Washington can only cope with so many foreign policy crises at one time, no matter what big country it is. And there are currently two big foreign policy crises. There is a Russian invasion of Ukraine, and was the situation in Gaza following the Hamas attack on Israel. That if there was a third crisis, they wouldn't be able to deal with it. And because Washington is driven by crisis, rather than the long-term maintenance on gardening work that needs to be done, then you see the attention shift from crisis to crisis. That is sort of at the sort of level of the administration. I think what is challenging for Asia is that the US has looked at Asia, pivoted to Asia, spoke about the right things for Asia, but hasn't quite followed through. And I speak mainly of the economic relationship. The security relationship is active in Asia. What they're doing with the Philippines, sort of operating in the South China Sea, building up AUKUS, building up the Quad. But I think the missing part for the region, and that was the big disappointment I had, was really the economic bits of it. From the time that I got there and we were working on a Trans-Pacific partnership, and then the US stepped away from that, sort of focusing then on IPEF and not being able to take through the economic, because what the region needs, what every country wants, is a strong US economic engagement. Because what your businesses do, that will be supported by the administration's economic engagement. Otherwise, your businesses will feel somewhat adrift. Where is the focus of the administration on these areas? I mean, you are here because there are opportunities over here. You cannot just supply a US consumer from the United States. You have to grow, you have to build out. And many of you have been here for 50 years, as long as Singapore's been around. There's sort of really that period in which, if you look back at the late 60s, early 70s, that's when US multinationals started coming out because they saw certain value. And Singapore has followed that system, rule of law, IP protection, all these things that essentially are US sort of approaches of dealing with economics. But the US itself has stepped away from economic engagement with the region. I think that is the missing piece, because then it makes it much harder to speak about why you need to be out in security terms if you do not have an economic part to it. So they are now focused on across the Atlantic again, both in Europe and the Middle East. There's less focused on Asia. But again, if they look at Asia, they should not just look at it from a security lens. They need to see an economic lens, because that will be a more enduring long-term relationship, because that's important.
Agreed. Thank you so much for that. You had mentioned when you were on your way out from Washington in a Straits Times interview, this phrase, drama-free relationship between the US and Singapore. I love that. But we love our drama. We just talked about Crazy Rich Asians.
There's good drama and there's bad drama.
Okay, all right. So I would like to explore this in our last few minutes of the LinkedIn Live session, this concept of a drama-free relationship. And I have to address the elephant in the room. Look, we're the American Chamber. Clearly, there is bias here. We are supporting, as I mentioned, American businesses and American business values. But the elephant in the room is always for us, how do we talk about China? Because our members typically represent companies that have regional presence, and often many of them, the leaders have responsibility over the Chinese market. And so you cannot have a drama-free relationship of any type, I feel, personal opinion, when China is in the room. So how do you feel about the drama of US-China relations? And just thinking about it also just from your lens, is just your opinion.
Well, Singapore navigates these relationships, as do all the countries in the region. And you have your drama between this is global power drama. We're small. We don't have to get involved in this global power drama. It's like, two large neighbors fighting and the rest of us sort of watch it and sort of not cheer it on, because we are concerned about US-China relations. We are concerned about the trend. We are concerned about the structural competition between the two. But there's very little that smaller countries can say or do. We will have our relationships with the United States, and we spoke a little bit about that. We will have our relationships with China, and these are good relationships. Where the challenge comes out is the US and China facing off against each other. And there is, whether they do it in a public manner or private manner, you see it's there. At the Shangri-La Dialogue 2 weeks ago, Secretary Austin was here, the Chinese Defense Minister was here. Look at their speeches. They were addressing each other directly in a way, because this is what we're saying. These are the lines I'm drawing, and these are the lines I'm drawing. And people in the room have to learn to live with that contestation between the US and China. We are hopeful that there can be a better, more productive relationship. Yes, there will always be competition among great powers, but there can be productive relationship between the two that makes the region a lot calmer. Because you do not want to see a region where there's a miscalculation or miscommunication that leads to a conflict that impacts all of us, your businesses and the countries of the region, very, very dramatically.
Well, thank you so much for that. I'm going to now move us into a more private discussion amongst those who've registered either online or in the room. But before we do that, we're going to transition with a few fun questions. You ready?
Okay.
All right. So the first question is, what's your favorite American food? You can define American however you want.
And I'm not a foodie, so I guess going to baseball games and having a hot dog. Yes. I wouldn't say it's my favorite food, but it's just the whole context of eating the meal.
That would be fun.
Yeah.
Second question is, what's your favorite, well, and you really have traveled a lot, so what's your favorite American city?
Washington, D.C.
Okay.
Hands down.
Yes.
I'm really a fan of Washington, D.C.
So we're all going there next to
Yes.
AmCham Business Mission, Washington, D.C. Okay. Okay, last question. The most tricky one. Who is your favorite American?
No, I will not answer to that. I'm not even sure. You say you spend so much time over here. No.
Right. Thank you so much for playing. We are going to now ask the team to move us off of LinkedIn Live. Thanks everyone for joining us on LinkedIn.
Yeah.